Good afternoon, everybody. President Ilves, dear ministers, dear ambassadors, dear members of parliament, dear students. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you today at the Zbigniew Brzeziński Memorial Lecture at the College of Europe in Natolin. We are always happy to have Toomas Hendrik Ilves as a speaker with us. After graduating from Columbia University and University of Pennsylvania, Mr. Ilves took a job in Radio Free Europe as a foreign policy analyst and then head of its Estonian desk until 1993. He then went back to Estonia and joined the Estonian Diplomatic Corps. He subsequently served as ambassador of the Republic of Estonia to the United States and Canada from 1993 to 1996, and as a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia from 1996 to 1998, and from 1999 to 2002. During his tenures, he was responsible for, among other things, Estonia's EU and NATO accession. In 2004, he became member of the European Parliament. In 2006, he became President of Estonia and was re-elected to this position for a second term in 2011. Our joy is doubled today as President Toomas Hendrik Ilves is here to take part in the Zbigniew Brzeziński Memorial Lecture, which was inaugurated by Madeleine Albright, the patron of the current promotion at the College of Europe. These lectures aim to highlight Zbigniew Brzeziński's political and diplomatic contributions, as well as his emphasis on ethics within politics and leadership. Zbigniew Brzeziński is widely recognized as a leading example of US statecraft. He played a crucial role in strengthening wider European reconciliation and regional security, two themes that underpin research and teaching at the College of Europe in Natolin. Ladies and gentlemen, Zbigniew Brzeziński and President Ilves share many values and views on international affairs, and especially on imperialist Russia. During their careers, they both had to face claims of being anti-Soviet or Russophobic. In the light of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine, we know they were right. Not because of biographical or geographical bias, but because of their knowledge and persistence, resulting from respect for values. Radio Free Europe is another link that joins Brzeziński and President Ilves. Let me underline the significance of Radio Free Europe. During the Cold War, it transmitted uncensored news and information. It has become a voice of conscience, liberty, and thus hope. Part of the power and strength of figures such as Brzeziński and Ilves lies in the fact that they were ready to speak out in the free word on behalf of those whose voices were at that time silenced and locked behind the Iron Curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, concluding, I would like to say that Zbigniew Brzeziński's thought and achievements are worth discussing not only in historical terms, but also as a way to describe the current world and politics. Brzeziński was a rare example of a political strategist who did not lock himself into a world of balance of power. In his outlook for the stability and security of Europe, the promotion of democracy and human rights was as important as military and economic power. In his credo, small states had the same right to development as superpowers. His commitment to values in politics made him a friend to all the oppressed nations of Eastern Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, continuing the debate and the reflections, I am delighted to announce to you that the College of Europe in Natolin this spring will organize the Zbigniew Brzeziński Geostrategic Roundtable on future of the European security order. And now, President Ilves, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Rector. I'm just getting ready for my water because it will run out. My throat will run out. But anyway, I just want to say before I begin that I'm very pleased to be here to speak at this podium. It's the same podium for the third time. So it's always great to come to Natolin. I'm glad that the European Union cares about this part of the world as well sometimes. You ain't heard nothing yet. Ladies and gentlemen, few challenges are intellectually more daunting, few honors in my life greater than to be asked to give a memorial address commemorating a man who for most of your life, or one's life, was an intellectual and moral idol, a quote realist who realized the fundamental truth that peace and security without democracy and a rule-based international order and human rights would be impossible to achieve. Add to that the additional challenge that the first time this memorial address was held, it was another idol, Madeleine Albright, who delivered it. Zbig and Madeleine, two of the great thinkers and creators of foreign security policy in the West, huge shoes to fill when my sole claim that all three of us are Colombians, that is in Columbia University, not we're the country with the capital of Bogota, and also that both of them called me Tom. But other than that, I mean, they're really up there. So while we recognize Zbigniew Brzeziński and his student, Madeleine Albright, as leading thinkers in their field, both of whom saw the fundamental importance of democracy as the basis of security for the West and indeed the world, it is all too telling that these two giants of foreign policy, both from the half of Europe that I come from, Central and Eastern Europe, had a broader vision as well as a more profound effect on our continent and relations between Europe and the United States than almost any European, self-styled European, of the past 50 years. Well, think about it. Think of where are the political geniuses in what, among the old Europe, as it were, to make it more clear. Indeed, it is more than odd that even today, more than a third of a century after the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe, that our region, the region that gave Zbigniew Brzeziński and Madeleine Albright their understanding of the Soviet Union, Russia, the importance of human rights and democracy, has almost no impact on our continent's foreign and security thinking. While two of the giants of the primary guarantor of European security, that is the United States, came from areas subjugated and devastated by wars between East and West. Wars in which we played almost exclusively the role of the victim. Our part of Europe, the Zwischenländer, the lands in between, have been the contested lands, or die umkämpften Ländereien, for more than a millennium, or to use Professor Timothy Snyder's depressing but all too apt name, the Bloodlands. Smaller than the lands to our east and west, our part of Europe has been caught between Homer's two great sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. Only careful navigation by Odysseus between the crashing rocks and the whirlpool of death allowed him to survive to reach his beloved Penelope. And so too, in our century, our own various leaders have occasionally allowed us to escape death and disaster on our road to democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the few non-trivial truths of international affairs we learned already 2,500 years ago from Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, in his conclusion on the subjugation and destruction of the people of the Greek island of Melos, a small island invaded by Athens. Its inhabitants, when they were invaded, appealed to law and their treaties to say their occupation and subjugation was illegal and unjust. To put in contemporary terms, Athenians violated international law, or maybe the Budapest Memorandum, I don't know, particular pick. The Athenians would have none of it. They deported and made slaves of the women and children of Melos. Its men were slaughtered. Thucydides concludes in his most famous line, "The strong do what they will, the weak do what they must." In Thucydidean terms, Central and Eastern Europe can best be characterized as a Melian archipelago. We are a stretch of small and weak states that have had to submit and often suffered horrific destruction from the Scylla in the west and Charybdis in the east. Indeed, we modern-day Melians have had too much of doing what we must and our neighbors doing what they will. Therefore, in the third of a century, since the democracy revolutions of 1989-91, we have placed at the core of our policies that never again will we allow ourselves to suffer the fate of our mothers and fathers, our ancestors, stretching 1,000 years back. This, too, is why we take what too many consider as just a cliché, the rule-based international order, far more seriously than others. Yes, we know the fate of the Melians and what resulted from having put their faith in treaties and agreements. But what else can we appeal to? For too many to our west, it's a cute cliche as well. A cliche that falls victim to self-interested so-called realism or realpolitik. And why for us, the rule-based European Union and NATO are of such importance. Ladies and gentlemen, the Melian tragedy is repeating today right before our eyes in Ukraine. Agreements are not kept. The strong do what they will, and the weak do what they must. Tellingly, I think Zbigniew Brzeziński would point out the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception of one country faltering in democracy, are the ones who try most to help a fellow victim. We see this in the percentages of GDP of military assistance given by Poland and the Baltic states, as well as the percentage of our own population in the number of Ukrainian refugees we have taken in. To say the task Europe faces in assisting our fellow Melian islander, Ukraine, is daunting is a massive understatement. While to our west we see Scylla dithering as Ukraine is sucked into the whirlpool, we know full well what happens if we lose Ukraine from the swath of democracies running from Estonia down to Slovenia. Zbig, in one of his most classically prescient aphorisms, captured the challenge. I quote, "Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." Let's unpack that a bit. What is Russia if it is no longer an empire? A large but pitifully corrupt developing country, Burkina Faso, with rockets to update Chan Smiley's characterization of the Soviet Union's erstwhile ally, Upper Volta, or a gas station masquerading as a country, to quote the late Senator John McCain. But as an empire, Russia means a country with imperial ambitions, thinking of itself as an empire, it will view the loss of its colonies not as phantom limb pain, but as prosthetics to gather up after temporarily losing them. The rhetoric of the Russian leadership almost any day extols the country as an empire, quite explicitly, adding Nazi-era genocidal threats against Ukrainians. Only last week, Putin spoke of restoring the old lands of the empire. A billboard in Moscow proclaims Russia knows no borders. That poster was put up already a month ago on the Russian side of the Narva River facing Estonia, featuring a big bear. Brzeziński's quote on Russia as an empire, if it includes Ukraine, dates from 2012, 12 years ago. Already then, he could sense the way Russia was headed under Putin and knew that with democracy increasingly stifled and autocracy growing stronger, how different Ukraine from Russia was becoming. Even under the Yanukovych regime and already before the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. He saw where the increasingly Western and democratic country was moving, and I quote a little longer here. Ukraine as a nation state is gaining a deeper emotional commitment from a younger generation, whether primarily Ukrainian or Russian-speaking, increasingly views Ukrainian statehood as normal and as part of its identity. Hence, time may not be working in favor of a voluntary submission of Kiev to Moscow, but impatient Russian pressures to that end, as well as the West's indifference, could generate a potentially explosive situation on the very edge of the European Union. Think of that. He said that 12 years ago. The difference between Russia as empire and Russia as just a large country is probably the most fundamental insight into the challenge facing European security since World War II. Had Ukraine been an independent country in 1945, Central and Eastern Europe would have been free a lot earlier, if they even had been subjugated. The Soviet Union as the reconstituted Russian Empire was the primary threat to European security until its collapse, subjugating both its inner empire of so-called republics as well as its outer empire of colonies in Central and Eastern Europe. Personally, I would say Zbigniew Brzeziński's insight is historically even more profound and grounded in realism, as it were. It goes back to 1709 when Karl XII of Sweden, no friend of Poland, I should add, lost the battle where? Where did Karl XII lose the battle? In Poltava, yes. And where's Poltava? Ukraine. This was the beginning of the Russian Empire, formally in 1721, which, inter alia, resulted in the annexation of Estonia, Livonia, and Ingria, the Finnic lands of around the Gulf of Finland, and a result of the Friedrichshamn, mistakenly called the Neustadt Treaty, incorporated Finland itself into the Russian Empire in 1809. The challenge of European security since the 18th century and since 1848, the challenge also to the idea of a liberal Europe, has been Russia as an empire. For if you recall your European history, it was thanks to the gendarme of Europe that came in to crush the liberal revolutions of 1848. The credo of Russian rule then, as it regrettably remains today under Putin, as it was formulated by Nicholas I, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. Pravoslavie, samodержавие, narodnost. A melding of dictatorship, nationalism, and theocracy. It's a bad mix. Look at Iran. 35 years ago, in 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I began writing an essay called A Continent of Exiles. It was what turned out to be an incredibly naive idea on how now Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, and the erstwhile Czechoslovakia had regained their freedom in the West, or regained their freedom, that the West would finally learn that the exiles from those countries, from Prague 68, from Budapest 56, or from World War II, including people like Zbigniew Brzeziński, had been right, and that the others had been wrong. I thought that once people heard what the victims in our countries with an immediate and contemporary experience of dictatorship said, that we would find vindication for what the refugees had been warning about for some almost 50 years. What a naive belief. Fortunately, Estonia's own liberation movement had become so red hot by the time that I started writing this, that I had no time to finish that essay. Thank God. For what I soon discovered was that instead it was no longer merely the voice of exiles, but the empirical experiences of Central and Eastern Europeans themselves that were denigrated, as if they too were exiles with their hair on fire, to quote an expression used against us. Zbigniew Brzeziński knew this all too well. Quote, "Who trusts the Pole for advice on Russia?" was how Averell Harriman, once considered the doyen of American experts on Russia, characterized Brzeziński. What Harriman was saying and what we have been hearing ever since 1989 in reality was, don't trust what people who actually know what they're talking about and have experience with. Listen to what we say, not them. Indeed, as we can attest, they did not listen to us. I suppose it must have been especially galling for Brzeziński to be at Columbia's Harriman Institute, a leading center for the study of Russia and Eastern and Central Europe. Frankly, I think my alma mater should change the name. But the attitude was and remains widespread, an attitude towards Eastern and Central Europe that is both arrogant and Orientalist, to use a term coined by another Columbia scholar, Edward Said, to characterize the haughty and the contemptuous view of the West toward the East. Said wrote of the way that Western academics treated what used to be called the Orient, yet it applies equally to Central and Eastern Europe. As Mary Sarraute, in her recent book from last year, Not 1 Inch, on NATO's eastward alignment, as early as in March 1990, a mere 4 months after the fall of the wall, a senior Austrian official told Undersecretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger why his country had suddenly reversed policy and suddenly applied to join the European community, as the EU was known then. Quote, "We have to get in before the swamp," is what he said. It's a widespread attitude affecting not only policymakers but the general public as well. When my bicycle was stolen in 1991 in Munich, I told my apartment house's Hausmeister, and her answer was, "Kaum gestohlen, morgen in Polen." Stolen today, tomorrow in Poland. We now know from the Helmut Kohl memos published in April of last year, or now actually, before that, 2022, in Der Spiegel, that the Chancellor of Germany in 1990 was opposed to the reestablishment of independence for the Baltic states. An interesting position from the leader of a country whose earlier chancellor had instigated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact dividing Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia, with the occupation by the Soviets of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So much for the vaunted policy of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which, by the way, continues to be the official policy of German policy of dealing with its past. After we nonetheless declared our independence, despite his opposition, Kohl also bitterly opposed both EU and NATO membership for the Baltic states.
We all know this stance. How no one listened to what we said, how the frontline Baltic states were the only ones not to get contingency plans in NATO, that is the planning needed in case we were invaded. Belgium, Canada, Portugal all had NATO plans drawn up just in case, but not those countries most threatened. After all, it might offend Russia. We know how after the invasion of Georgia, the president of Finland, when asked why her country did not protest when Estonia did, she replied, "Finland is the easternmost Nordic country, not the northernmost Baltic country." She followed that up for some reason that the Estonians protested because, quote, they suffer from a post-Soviet traumatic stress syndrome. We know how, too, after the invasion of Georgia, the president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, pushed through restoration of Russia's partnership and cooperation agreement with Russia, even though it had not met the agreed-upon troop withdrawal as a condition for restoration of the PCA, as it was called. Nor has it met it to this day, and we recall how the United States in 2009 declared the reset, and that was that as far as Georgia was concerned. 20% of Georgia remains occupied by the Russian army to this day. All was forgiven. We recall how in 2014, the U.S. refused to send Ukraine arms. This despite the 1994 Budapest Agreement, whereby Ukraine gave up not only the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, but also its long-range bombers and missiles. Bombers and missiles that once belonged to Ukraine, and today the Russians, to this day, use against the country that gave them up. We recall how after the shoot down of MH17, the UK cabinet's instructions were to protest but do nothing that would harm Russian oligarchs' investments in London. Today, we see it when the president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, says that Germany owed Russia the Nord Stream pipeline because of what Germany had done to Russia in World War II, when the most to suffer, in fact, were Poland and Ukraine, the two countries most opposed to the pipeline project. We see it then, and I emphasize the timing, how 6 months after the discovery of the horrors of Bucha in March of 2022, the French President Emmanuel Macron that September was still warning about the warmongering Central and Eastern Europeans, though apparently, I'm told, his stance has now changed. Most recently, we saw 2 months ago when the Vice President of the European Commission said that the most cogent advocate of strong security in Europe, Prime Minister Kaja Kallas of my country, cannot become Secretary General because she comes from a country bordering Russia. Think about that. I mean, this is doubly obnoxious. For one, why is that relevant? In the Cold War, NATO defended not only the border of West Germany, but even West Berlin, deep in the territory of the Soviet military. But second, the longest ever serving Secretary General of NATO for 10 years already, Jens Stoltenberg, comes from Norway, a member of NATO since its founding in 1949, with a 195-kilometer border with Russia, about the same as Estonia. So you'd think that a senior official would know that. He probably does. He just doesn't want one of those Eastern Europeans in that position. Clearly, we have a stitch-up on the Secretary General position. It can't be an Eastern European. Instead, the Quad, the US, UK, France, and Germany have already agreed it must be Mark Rutte, who in his 10 years as Prime Minister of the Netherlands has not been able even to raise his country's defense expenditure to the 2% minimum agreed to by NATO 10 years ago. I'd like to see how he will cajole the rest of the laggards, to raise their defense spending. But we Eastern Europeans did it a long time ago. Ladies and gentlemen, there are myriad more examples of this kind of behavior and treatment of the Zwischenländer, the countries up against the Charybdis in the east, the ones most at risk, treated with disdain and as lesser countries by Scylla to our west. 448 million people live in the European Union. I did the addition the other night. Of those, 100 million live in the so-called new members that joined 20 years ago. That's more than 20% of the EU's population. Yet in the 4 European commissions and parliaments that have served since 2004, since then, and of the 4 most important positions in the EU, Commission President, EU Council President, the High Representative for Common Foreign Security Policy, and the President of the European Parliament, only 1.5 positions have been filled by anyone from among us, the Zwischenländer. Donald Tusk was Council President for one 5-year term, and Jerzy Buzek for half a term as President of the European Parliament. So that's 1.5 positions out of a possible 16. I repeat, 100 million Europeans live in our countries. Zbigniew Brzeziński, in a sense, was an embodiment of Central and Eastern Europe, a refugee from totalitarian rule who knew more about Russia than most others and was denigrated for it and for where he came from because he was a victim of that regime. And on top of that, he was right. He was one of the most consequential thinkers of foreign security policy in the West for the past 50 years. My question for all of you is, do you think, given the foregoing catalog of West European behavior toward its neighbors, its fellow EU members, NATO allies, that he would have been able, had he instead grown up in Western Europe? Do you think he would have had that effect? Well, we should think about it. And then we should think about what it is that we in the Zwischenländer need to do to change this state of affairs. So in conclusion, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here to honor one of my heroes, one of the intellectual giants of the past 80 years of transatlantic relations.